Welcome, everybody, to our live webinar, 9/11, An Architect's Guide, a three-part series. Today is Thursday, April 1st, 2021. I'm Richard Gage, AIA, member of the American Institute of Architects and founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. We're a 501c3 nonprofit organization representing a growing body of now more than 3,000 architects and engineers signed on to the petition demanding a new investigation into the destruction of all three World Trade Center skyscrapers on 9/11. This is part one, World Trade Center 7. It's about the third tower, a 47-story skyscraper that collapsed suddenly and symmetrically into its own footprint in under 7 seconds. And this was at 5:20 in the afternoon on September 11th. Before we dive into it, let me introduce you to our operations manager and the host of 9/11 Freefall, Mr. Andy Steele. Hey, Andy.
Hey, Richard. Hey, everybody. Thank you for tuning in today. I just want to let everyone know that I'm here to help with any technical glitches which will occur from time to time. Also, we'll be happy to take your questions at the end of the webinar today. You just submit them in the questions and information form, which is online at ae911truth.org. Just go to continuing education and click on the live webinars. You'll see the box. I'll also be looking over the Facebook comments and the YouTube comments associated with today's webinar for any good comments or questions that are associated or related rather to the material that Richard will be presenting. So with all of that said, back to you, Richard.
Thank you, Andy. And just so people know something about my background, let me just tell you about that. I was responsible at a local firm here in the San Francisco Bay Area for the construction documents for these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. More recently, before launching full-time into this important outreach effort, I had similar responsibilities working on this $125 million high school, and also this important project in Las Vegas with 6 blocks of retail, mid-rise office space, and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproofed steel framing. I now work full-time educating architects, engineers, and others to understand what really happened at the World Trade Center using the material in these courses. So let's jump into it. Did you even know? I didn't. When I first got into this in 2006, I was shocked to learn that there was a third skyscraper that came down on 9/11. Most architects and engineers are completely unaware of it, even though it's the third worst structural failure in modern history. And so don't feel bad if you didn't know about it. Most people do not. And we're starting with that today because nobody, according to the official story anyway, nobody died in this building, so it didn't receive the attention. But there's other reasons, as you will see, that it did not receive the attention that it should have. Well, what is it? It's a 47-story skyscraper, be the tallest buildings in most of our states. The architect was Emery Roth and Sons, and the structural engineer Irwin Cantor. So it was part of the World Trade Center complex, occupying this position here just outside the superblock of WTC 7 buildings. It was developed by Larry Silverstein, excuse me, a real estate magnate, if you will, and he had developed it in the mid 80s. Later, he took control of the entire super block of buildings known as the World Trade Center. We'll talk about that when we get into part 2, the Twin Towers, next week. But this building was just 110 yards from the North Tower. When the North Tower went down, some of the debris hit the building and started some fires. But you can see it's standing fine here amidst the chaos around it as the World Trade Center towers, Twin Towers, fell at about that morning, around 9 o'clock to 9:30. So but it's standing just fine. It had some damage from some of the beams that hit it, and NIST acknowledges that this damage was an relatively insignificant factor in the building's collapse, and I'll show you why. But let's first look at the building come down, as you see now. The east penthouse on the left falls first. And then 7 seconds later, the entire building comes straight down. So we've seen this, right? It's like the old hotels in Las Vegas. So it would be intuitive for us to make an assessment that this was brought down by controlled demolition. But no, we're going to take a look at the official story, which is quite different and uses quite a path of twists and turns to justify their position that this building came down due to normal office fires. Let's listen to Shyam Sunder of the NIST organization, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, who was tasked by Congress to explain the collapse of this building and the Twin Towers. Let's listen.
What we found was that uncontrolled building fires caused an extraordinary event. The collapse of World Trade Center 7 was primarily due to fire.
Okay, what fires? Well, these are the fires that were in the building. They started on the south side of the building, and they moved around, as we'll take a look. But these are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of in the building. So as you can see, they're few, they're relatively small, and they're scattered throughout the building. So let's look a little bit deeper into this and find out, how can these fires bring this building down? Well, first of all, we look on the east side. The fires are at 2:30 p.m. and 3 p.m. By 3 p.m., they're moving toward the west side and away from the area of critical concern that NIST hypothesizes as the collapse initiation, which is occurring, they say, under the east penthouse, because it did fall first. So a reasonable hypothesis. And column 79 is the area of concern. The damage was on the other side of the building. So that's why they're suggesting that it was relatively insignificant in the building's collapse. But they have a path of the fire that they claim it took, and it being the fire on the 12th floor, because that's of critical concern for them. As that fire moved its way over to column 79, they're saying hovering around column 79 on the northeast side of the building for about an hour and a half. So we find that there's a problem with this, not just one problem, but as NIST even acknowledges, that fires don't persist in any one location for longer than 20 or 30 minutes. So how can it be hovering in that area for an hour and a half? That's a critical problem and inconsistency for them to solve. But more importantly, even, is that those fires were burned out on the 12th floor, according to the photographs, more than an hour before the building collapsed. And as you'll see, their entire collapse theory revolves around that fire burning on that floor at that location at the time of the collapse. So this is critically important. Now, more correctly, the photographs show that that fire, according to our own simulation, we have the fires starting at 2 o'clock on the east side, moving past column 79. By 4 o'clock, they're well past column 79, as the photographs reveal and the videos. And their fires completely burned out on that floor before the building collapses, even at 5 p.m. So that's really, really important. I'm going to make a quick note here. Hang on one second. Got a typo in my PowerPoint. So continuous improvement here. And so we're going to look and see now more critically at the official story from Shyam Sunder, the project leader of this NIST report.
Our study has identified thermal expansion as a new phenomenon that can cause the collapse of a structure. For the first time, we have shown that fire can induce a progressive collapse.
Okay, so fire is inducing a progressive collapse by thermal expansion. Let's go in a little deeper to their computer model.
And you can see on the screen, the column at the very right is column 79. And that's the column that first buckles, causing the floors to come down, followed by a quick succession of failures of adjoining column.
Okay, let's break that down. Let's look at the actual theory here. What they're saying is that the fire near this column 79, raging in this area at the time of the collapse, caused these beams to expand. That's the thermal expansion part of their story, pushing this girder off of its seat on this column 79, causing floor 13 to fall on 12, 12 on 11, and so on for 9 floors, leaving column 79 unbraced, at which time it buckles, and then causing this progressive collapse on the east side of the building that they claim then took another 7 seconds to drop the whole building straight down uniformly, as you saw in the videos. So none of that actually could be true, and let's just break it down. These beams are fireproofed. They're not going to be able to attain the heat required to expand them. And here you can see halfway through the application of that fireproofing. This one's not fireproof. This part of it is. They're just not done yet. So that fireproofing, as you'll see later, is 4 times a minimum of 4 times more fireproofing than is needed to protect that beam from thermal expanding. That's called the fire only lasting 20 minutes in a given area. The fireproofing lasting 2 hours on beams in these steel frame high-rise buildings. So not only that, but the girder could not have been pushed even if that beam did expand. And by the way, they got that beam to expand by putting all of the heat, like 1400 degrees Fahrenheit, into that beam in just 1.5 seconds in their computer model, which would have, in the computer model, forced them to expand rather than sag. But no, they needed to expand because they needed this girder to fall off of its seat. So they claimed that there were no shear studs on this girder, even though the shop drawings indicate that there were, as you can see here. 30 shear studs, which are bolts that are embedded in the steel, welded to the steel and embedded in the concrete slab up above. So that girder is not going to be pushed sideways. No way, no how. But they ignore that key structural component, and they claim that this girder pushed off of its seat. Now, here's the seat. It would have had to have been pushed 12 inches in order to be pushed off of its seat. The thermal expansion, even if these beams were pushing on it, could only have pushed it about 5 inches. Well, NIST said, well, it only had to be pushed off 6 inches because the flange, the bottom piece of this wide flange beam, folded after the web crossed the end of the seat. So they ignored another key structural component in order to make that happen. These 3/4 inch stiffeners shown in red here in plan, and here, and here in elevation. So those were in fact there. The shop drawings here show them, and so there's only one reason NIST could have had for ignoring them, so that they could make this claim that this girder pushes off of its seat in this direction and only halfway, and then the flange folding. Well, those stiffeners would have kept the flange from folding. So even so, if all of that could have happened, you would not have had the floor 13 falling, because there's two other major girders framing into that column, which would have kept most of that floor from ever falling at all. In fact, it would have taken 10 times more dynamic force than was available in this system in order to break the floor connections, girder connections below. Would have taken 632,000 pounds, but there's only 60,000 pounds available. So that progressive collapse never could have happened, even if all of their fanciful machinations in this initiation of collapse theory were true. Let's go ahead and look at their computer model, because it's even more revealing.
Here is our structural model showing the building collapsing, which matches quite well with the video of the event.
We'll see how well it matches. In fact, let's do that right now. Here's the video on the left. The penthouse comes down first. Okay, we'll give them that. But then there's a complete destruction of almost every connection holding the steel frame together on the east side of this building. And it begins to warp like a beer can, like you'd expect it to, because those beams are tied to the exterior perimeter structure. So you'd expect massive deformation on the exterior of the building with any interior progressive collapse commencing. But you don't see that in the video whatsoever. You see maybe a dozen windows broken, indicating there's some shock to the building, but not the scale of destruction that we're seeing. And even they stop the computer simulation 2 seconds into the collapse, indicating that the overall collapse, indicating that they don't want us to see any more. Why? Well, it begins to tip over. It looks nothing like the videos of the collapse. So we submitted a request for information, which you can do with agencies that commit fraud like this, and they write back saying, we deny your request to see our computer input data. Why would you want to see that? It might jeopardize public safety, they say. Well, wouldn't it jeopardize public safety to withhold this information from the architects and engineers who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? So we use the scientific method at AE 911 Truth. What is it? We have a question. How did the tower come down? We do some background research. How have other towers come down? We make observations. We take our best guess, a hypothesis. Maybe it came down by fire, a reasonable hypothesis. The building had fires. Controlled demolition becomes an even more reasonable hypothesis as we follow it today and see where it leads. We make predictions based on these hypotheses, and we don't focus solely on one hypothesis over another, due, for instance, to our financial or political obligations that might sway our objective opinion in the matter of how a building came down. For instance, we test them with experiments, we analyze the results, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner. We don't hide the computer input data from the architects and engineers who might peer review the work, especially in a public investigation like all of 9/11 was or should have been. If a hypothesis is not corroborated, we go back, we try again, we come up with new hypothesis until we have one that is corroborated by the data, the experiments, the predictions, etc., until it all makes sense. So with that in mind, let's do just a little bit of background research, which NIST apparently failed to do. How have buildings been destroyed by fire. Well, not in a high-rise building have we ever lost a high-rise due to fire, a steel frame high-rise, fireproofed. But say fire is an organic process. It moves through a building every 20 minutes or so. That's noted here. It burns out because even NIST acknowledges that they don't last longer than 20 or 30 minutes, even though their whole theory relies on an hour and a half of building on fire on that floor. The skyscrapers we have not lost. In wood frame building, it would have fallen over to the path of least resistance, not straight down through the cold, hard, intact structure beneath the level of the fire. We would never expect a pancaking collapse due to fire. Well, what would we expect in a steel frame building on fire? Well, we had the largest test of its kind in the UK in 1995. They had incredible fuel loads. As you can see here, they really wanted to know what happened to these beams. So they built this 8-story building out of steel, as you can see, some of which is fireproofed and some of which is not. They tested every condition. It was a very rigorous test.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In over 20 years, I have not seen, until recently, a protected steel structure that has collapsed in a fire.
He's referring here to until 9/11, when we had not 2, but 3 protected steel structures collapse due to fire that day. The executive summary cites that this is inherently stable behavior due to the highly redundant nature of the structural steel form. The connections do not fail. NIST had 400 structural steel connections failing per second during the 7 seconds of the overall collapse of that building. There's warpage that can occur, certainly, on non-fireproofed portions of this test building. All of Building 7 steel was fireproofed. So we haven't lost a skyscraper that's fireproofed steel framed due to fire. Let's look.
May 4th, 1988, the First Interstate Bank, a 62-story building in Los Angeles, California, suffered a 3.5-hour fire which burned across 5 floors and caused an estimated $200 million of damage. It did not collapse. February 23rd, 1991, the One Meridian Plaza, a 38-story building in Philadelphia, suffered an 18-hour fire which burned across 8 floors. The fire caused an estimated $100 million worth of damage and 3 firefighters died fighting it. It was later described by officials as the most significant fire of the century. It did not collapse. October 17, 2004, the East Tower of the Park Central complex in Caracas, Venezuela, suffered a 17-hour fire which spread across 26 of its 56 floors. It did not collapse. August 18, 2007, a fire broke out on the 17th floor of the Deutsche Bank building in New York, a building undergoing deconstruction after being heavily damaged by debris from the South Tower on 9/11. Originally 41 stories in height, it had been reduced to 26 at the time of the fire, which lasted 7 hours and affected a total of 10 floors. 2 firefighters died of smoke inhalation. It did not collapse. On 9/11 itself, 5 World Trade Center, a 9-story building east of the North Tower, was engulfed in flames after sustaining heavy damage from falling debris. A number of partial collapses occurred, but the overall structure remained standing. February 9, 2009, the Mandarin Oriental Hotel in Beijing was completely engulfed in flames for more than 3 hours during the Lunar New Year celebrations. The fire affected all 44 floors, igniting fireworks as it burned. 1 firefighter died fighting it. It did not collapse.
No, and neither did these high-rise, fully engulfed fires collapse the buildings after 9/11. It just doesn't happen. So those should have been the most, particularly Building 7, which wasn't hit by an airplane, should have been the most studied structural failure in history. But no, the architects and engineers are mostly completely unaware of it. In fact, the American Institute of Architects, of which I'm one of 90,000 members, didn't issue one bulletin on this, the third worst structural failure in modern history. So let's look at some buildings that have collapsed due to natural causes. In this case, earthquakes. We have a building that's recognizable, certainly damaged, but recognizable as a building after it falls. The columns and the beams are not severed one from another. The concrete is not pulverized to a fine powder. So keep this in mind. Now, these buildings were destroyed by explosions. We have thick, billowing, enormous, pyroclastic-like clouds. That comes from the term volcanic, the incredible heat, with airborne pulverized solids from the building expanding and rapidly expanding, cauliflower-shaped forms due to the incredible heat from the ignition of the hot gases from the explosions. We have witnesses that hear sounds of explosions. They see flashes of light. If we have these features, we know we have explosions. Explosions can be harnessed quite effectively in high-rise buildings to bring them down, as you see in this series of controlled demolitions, just like the old hotels in Las Vegas that we've all seen on TV. There's only a handful of companies that can accomplish this. It's actually quite intricate engineering to place these shaped cutter charges throughout the columns and beams in the building at key locations and detonate them in a very precise order in order to bring the building down how they want. So there's a set of features associated with these demolitions. What are they? Let's look at them. We have a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure, but not always. It can occur other places too. Straight down, symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. They do that by removing the column supports all at once on a given floor or within a fraction of a second of each other. This results in a near free fall acceleration straight down through the path of what should have been the greatest resistance, the thousands of tons of structure beneath, resulting also in the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame. With limited damage to adjacent structures, that's one of the goals of controlled demolition. Feature 7, there's patterned explosions heard by witnesses and flashes of light seen by them. The concrete floors are broken up, if not pulverized, as we'll see in Building 7. They don't want to have to go back and jackhammer concrete floors and let the explosives do that work. And so there's explosive charges visible at many of the floors. Sometimes these are called squibs in the explosives demolition industry. And of course, chemical evidence left behind of explosive devices. If you have these features, you can be sure that you have destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. Fires cause structures to collapse asymmetrically with gradual deformations following the path of least resistance. With additional circumstantial corroborative testimony and evidence, an eyewitness testimony like government documentation, that can be very helpful. You don't just bring one of these buildings down without a series of approvals from various agencies, typically. So there's foreknowledge of the destruction. Therefore, people know about it in advance. They talk about it. We'll see some of that today. Experts agree, hey, that's a controlled demolition. At least those experts without financial or political obligations that would sway their objective opinion in the matter of whether a demolition or a building collapse is a demolition or not. With video documentation, which we'll be looking at more of today, we can determine, is this proof of controlled demolition? This is a body of proof that we're now going to apply to building 7. Beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the building? Let's watch Dan Rather, his view of this building's collapse, and listen to what he has to say.
What you're seeing are hive shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Describe that. Now we go to videotape the collapse of this building.
It's amazing.
Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down.
What was that, Dan? Destroyed by well-placed dynamite to knock it down? Well, he's using his intuition, as we should all, once we get outside the effect of the psychological operation known as shock and awe against the American people that we have with 9/11. We can see with our own eyes, because we've all seen the old hotels in Las Vegas, for instance. So this is Dan using his rational resources, but we didn't hear him talk about this after 9/11. No, we didn't see this building, in fact, come down on TV, with 2 exceptions. And after 9/11, it's as if it's been swept under the rug. Why? Well, because it's so obviously, especially looking at the forensic evidence we're going to be looking at today, a controlled demolition. Number 2, is there a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint? Let's look from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. So look at the penthouse. The east penthouse has already come down. It was on the left. This is the overall collapse. Notice the entire screen wall and west penthouse drops just a half a second prior to the overall collapse. What does this indicate? That the supporting structure underneath them was taken out all at once. Now, this is what you do in controlled demolition. You take out the interior columns, followed a fraction of a second later by the exterior columns. Also, this completely pulls the rug out from underneath the NIST theory, which says that the collapse starts on the left with the east penthouse and then gradually moves from left to right, which is east to west. But no, that is clearly not what's happening. The core structure is taken out all at once. And that's critical to our understanding of what happened in this building. And it falls into its own footprint. The center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint, as you see in all the photographs. The columns and beams, it falls like a house of cards. The columns and beams severed one from another. Maybe we're not quite convinced yet. Let's put building 7 on the left, a known controlled demolition on the right. Is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives? Especially since fire, the official cause of this building's collapse, has never brought down a skyscraper and should in itself require extraordinary evidence, because it's an extraordinary hypothesis that they're claiming. Controlled demolition probably should have been the first, if not the only rational hypothesis put forward, but no. It was relegated to a series of very frequently asked questions of NIST, published 10 years later on their website. You can't make this stuff up. Here's question 13. NIST Did investigators consider the possibility that an explosion caused or contributed to the collapse? NIST starts out. NIST concluded the blast events inside the building did not occur, found no evidence supporting the existence of a blast event. The smallest blast capable of falling the building's critical column, complete speculation here, would have resulted in a sound level of 130 decibels. Well, maybe that's true if high energy explosives were used. But there are witnesses of explosions, as you'll see, and there is evidence of technology producing lower audio signatures, as you'll see. But we're expected to believe that these small, randomly placed fires brought this building down symmetrically. I mean, all you have to do is think about it. In order to bring a building down symmetrically, you have to have the patterned removal of column supports, all of the interior columns, followed a second later or so by the exterior columns. Any deviation from that pattern and the building will begin to fall over. This is quite a science they use to bring buildings down. It doesn't happen by accident in fires. But these fires brought that, did that damage? Do they have that level of precision? Come on. Is there a free fall acceleration straight down through the path of greatest resistance? What? Free fall? Yeah. NIST was embarrassed by members of AE 9/11 Truth into admitting, finally, after first denying for years and years, that this building had free fall. Take a look at physics teacher David Chandler's analysis here.
Just by watching it, anybody can see that Building 7 fell close to free fall. To measure it, I used software to track the corner of the building and compute a graph of downward velocity as a function of time. The graph had a long, straight section indicating constant acceleration. Measuring the slope, I found the acceleration to be within 1% of the acceleration of gravity for the first 2.5 seconds. In other words, the building fell through its own structure with zero resistance.
Zero resistance?
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction.
Indeed, there is. In fact, steel columns have a particular property that even after they buckle, they bend, they will always have a minimum of about 25% of their strength left to support, it won't necessarily support the building, but it will slow down the acceleration. But even NIST acknowledges there was no slowing down. It accelerated faster and faster, the velocity faster and faster each second, the definition of acceleration. It's as fast as a bowling ball falling out of the sky, which means zero resistance, which means not one of those 82 columns on each floor gave any resistance during a third of this building's 7-second collapse. Think about it. It can't happen. And do we have the total dismemberment of the structural steel frame? Yeah. It falls like a house of cards. Every column is dismembered almost from every other beam attached to it. Remember, buildings that collapse naturally, you don't have the severing of the columns from the beams. Some of them certainly in badly damaged buildings like this. Do we have limited damage to adjacent structures? Yeah, there's fairly limited damage. The Verizon building and the post office sustained some damage, but the center of the pile is in the center of the building's footprint. Do we have sounds of explosions heard by witnesses? Well, let's go first to the official story and see what they claim.
We did not find any evidence that explosives were used in the collapse of Building 7. We ran down detailed computer simulations of blast scenarios. This size blast would have produced an incredibly loud sound that was not recorded on videos of the collapse nor reported by witnesses.
Well, there are plenty of witnesses, and I'll show them to you. And again, we'll look at some technology that has even softer sounds to bring down buildings. First, Daryl, a medical student.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and it was horrifying. Then about a second later, the bottom caved out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground.
Okay, and let's go to Kevin Mcpadden, former Air Force medic.
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds, you heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
And this gentleman.
I'm going to call in Bill Rizzotti. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you could just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
And this gentleman, Barry Jennings, who, along with Mayor Giuliani's attorney, Michael Hess, hadn't realized that the building had been evacuated, and they went into it after the planes hit the towers because they're reporting to the 23rd floor where the emergency operations center was. And they couldn't get up in the elevator, so they're going up the stairs, wondering what the heck's going on around them. And this is all before the towers collapsed.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
Also the sound?
Like a boom, like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Information of bombs. Bombs like this on the late morning of 9/11 in the vicinity of Building 7.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
How many of these witnesses do you imagine were included in either the FEMA or the NIST report? 0. Not one of them. And yet they claim to have interviewed 1,000 witnesses or hundreds of witnesses and 1,000 videos. These were all available. There's another witness, and that is the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, 20 miles north of the World Trade Center. There was a 0.6 magnitude event produced near the time of the collapse, attributed by NIST to the time of the collapse. But let's look a little carefully at it, because the peak seismic signal occurs at 5:20 and 42 seconds. but the building doesn't start collapsing until 10 seconds after that. So how can the collapse of the building possibly cause the seismic signal 10 seconds earlier? Well, NIST has an answer for this. Likely due to the falling of debris from inside the collapse. Because remember, they postulate that the collapse gutted the building inside 7 seconds before the whole building, overall building collapse happened. But look, you can see right here, the east penthouse falls is all that falls 7 seconds earlier. The west penthouse and screen wall fall only a half a second earlier. So how can that be responsible for the seismic signal 10 seconds earlier than the collapse of the overall collapse of the building? So again, we've exposed and continue to expose fraud after fraud after fraud in the NIST report. Now, Andre Rousseau comes along, a geophysics expert, author of more than 50 published papers on progressive mechanical waves and geology, says, no, these undeniably have an explosive origin. The bell-like form of the graph points to an impulsive source of energy, not percussion on the ground due to the falling of debris. Seismic waves are only created by brief impulses and low frequencies. These undeniably have an explosive origin. Okay, what else can we learn from sources like the National Fire Protection Association Guide 921 for fire and explosion investigations? Because we're looking here for answers to where all these pyroclastic-like clouds and extreme heat came from. It says in the manual, look for large volumes of gas and the large amount of heat released in chemical explosions, causing rapidly expanding plumes of hot gases. Well, this is exactly what was observed directly after the collapse, or as the building's collapsing, racing 35 miles away from the collapse of Building 7. These clouds are expanding in every direction in cauliflower-shaped forms, expanding rapidly, many, many times larger than the building. Where's all the heat coming from that's responsible for this cauliflower-shaped expansion? Is it coming from these fires, which even these small fires were almost certainly extinguished by the mechanical action of these falling floors? No, we're looking for a source of heat much greater than those fires, something on the order of this. And we find it. We start with this persistent heat documented by the NASA air flights, the infrared sensitive cameras, doing a thermal map of World Trade Center, finding temperatures on the surface of Building 7 that are 1,340 degrees. That's hotter than most office fires ever get. And it's on the surface. But do we have a fire on the surface of this building aftermath? No, there's no fire. Again, surely the fires were put out. Why is there 1,340 degrees on the surface? It's surely evidence of something much hotter down deep in the pile, which as it reaches the surface is cooled off to 1,340 degrees. And we find such evidence. Let's start with structural engineer Abulhassan Astani Azal. I saw melting of girders at the World Trade Center. Office fires don't melt girders.
I saw melting of girders in World Trade Center.
Well, these are the melted girders he's referring to in part, and this is one that he documented from the World Trade Center 7 steel. That is the melted girder. again, steel doesn't begin to melt until 2,800 degrees, more than twice the temperatures of the hottest office fires. This fire engineer says steel members in the debris pile that appear to have been partly evaporated in extraordinarily high temperatures. The author of the FEMA report, fire protection engineer Jonathan Barnett. There's a problem here, though. It takes 4,000 degrees to evaporate steel, more than 4 times the temperature of most office fires. This is actually documented in the FEMA report, which came out before NIST took over the investigation. Appendix C of the May of 2002 Building Performance Team report documents never before observed eutectic reactions, intergranular melting, capable of turning a solid steel girder into Swiss cheese, like we see here in this piece of World Trade Center 7 steel. Rapid oxidation and sulfidation, the report finds. Liquid iron, that's molten iron, that's 2,800 degrees minimum Fahrenheit. Sulfur formed during this hot corrosion attack on the steel. They have no idea where the sulfur came from. Perhaps the deepest mystery uncovered in the investigation, says the New York Times, but this is completely eliminated from the report when NIST takes over. In fact, the whole report, Appendix C, metallurgical investigation, is eliminated from the NIST report, not included in the NIST report. NIST says, oh, we couldn't test. We had no steel from World Trade Center 7. Well, you just saw the steel, but again and again and again, they lie, saying that there's no steel recovered. No metallography could be carried out. Well, we actually have metallography samples from NIST, and they show temperatures not exceeding 250 degrees Fahrenheit. That was in the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Here they're talking about 7. But here's the piece of steel they did recover. So they are lying. Here's John Gross on the pile, proudly showing the coupon or steel sample that was given to FEMA to include in the Appendix C. And then John Gross saw fit to eliminate that when they produced their final report on Building 7. His shadow is all over the evidence. So maybe the fires, according to Thomas Iger, were 1,200 degrees Fahrenheit. There's a range of fires. NIST claims in the Twin Towers 1,800 degree fires. We'll get to that next week in part 2 and 3, particularly 3 of this series. Structural steel doesn't begin to melt until 2,800 degrees. What could be responsible for these temperatures? Well, hydrocarbons, which is building office contents and jet fuel even, only burn 600 degrees to 1,400 degrees. Yet steel had definitely melted, as we see here in this debris, in the aftermath, in the jaws of this crab claw excavator. We can tell by the color of molten metals what their temperature is. In this case, exceeding 2,500 degrees, liquid molten metal falling. So we know how hot it is, and we know that office fires don't get that hot. So what does? Let's look at thermite as a possibility. That's a rational hypothesis because it has some characteristics that match the evidence. So what is it anyway?
An incendiary used by the military, thermite is a compound of iron oxide and aluminum, which when ignited sustains an extreme heat reaction, creating molten iron. In just 2 seconds, Thermite can reach temperatures over 4,500 degrees Fahrenheit, quite enough to liquefy steel. We know that open-air fires cannot burn hot enough to melt steel, but metal had melted at the base of the towers. Appendix C of the FEMA report describes sulfur residues on the World Trade Center steel. The New York Times called this the deepest mystery of all. Sulfur slightly lowers the melting point of iron, and iron oxide and iron sulfide had formed on the surface of the structural steel. Sulfur used with thermite is called thermate, producing even faster results.
Maybe we're getting somewhere here, because if thermite were used, it would explain the incredible heat, 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, that the official story can't possibly explain. And so they don't try. It would also explain the presence of sulfur, because sulfur is added to thermite to become thermate, becoming much more effective at cutting through steel. And it would also explain the vast presence of elemental iron. Molten iron is a byproduct of thermite, which we're about to show you the evidence of. So the National Fire Protection Guide 921 says, hey, look for unusual residues that could arise from thermite, magnesium, or other pyrotechnic materials. This found no corroborating evidence to suggest that explosives were used. Did you look? A year later, when pressed, they finally admit in writing, this did not test for the presence of explosive residue. You can't find what you won't test for. This is completely disingenuous, of course. Others found it. It wasn't that hard to find. Stephen Jones, nuclear physicist, formerly from Brigham Young University, applies his talents to the effort, having been given a piece of slag from the ends of the steel beam in this sculpture in Canada. He first notes that, gosh, the beam itself is a jagged cut with thick slag hanging off of it. That's not what oxyacetylene torches, this is what oxyacetylene torches and thermal lances do, which is what the iron workers were using to cut the steel at the site. Not this jagged edge as you see here, but a nice clean cut as you see here. Not jagged edges like here with thick slag on them. But the analysis of this slag produces what? Iron. Elemental iron. Not steel, but elemental iron and manganese. And sulfur. And aluminum. Thermite, as you saw, was a mixture of aluminum powder and iron oxide, which is essentially rust. So it's very interesting. Why is he finding the ends of these beams having this evidence? Well, he looks at the U.S. Geological Survey itself in their particle atlas of the World Trade Center dust, who finds in all of their samples billions of previously molten iron microspheres. Billions of them. They don't know where they came from. They don't even speculate. But up to 6% of some of these samples are previously molten iron microspheres, about a 1/16 of an inch long diameter, the largest of them. Some of them almost naked to the human eye. It amounts to about 4 tons of this material by extrapolation. 150 times more than the background value quantities of iron that you can see in office dust. It's just there in the air. No, these are spherical, and they are much more plentiful. In fact, the R.J. Lee Group, an independent environmental engineer doing their own studies on the dust, says that they're formed during the event, not before by the welders putting the building together, not after by the ironworkers cutting the building apart, but during the event, the melting of iron, requiring, again, 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit. In fact, the EPA says this is a signature component used to distinguish the World Trade Center dust from common office building dust. It's not even World Trade Center dust unless it has these billions of previously molten iron microspheres in it. Well, how would they get there? Well, here's the thermite experiment. The experiment is the arbiter of competing hypotheses. And in this experiment, we have a small amount of thermite, which produces a large flash, extreme temperatures, and lots of sparks, which he thought were sparks, but no, this is molten iron microspheres. How do they get spherical? Well, aerosolized liquids form themselves into spheres by surface tension. That's just the nature of what it does. Could that be what's responsible, by the way, for the toasting of the tops of these cars in and around the World Trade Center in this very high heat event, which the first responders were talking about all of this heat from these clouds that they were running from. So you can make thermite in your own backyard and cutter charges, as John Cole, civil engineer, did in Florida. Take a look. You can see that these explosions, and you can hear, but they're not quite as loud as bangs produced by high energy explosives. But they still have sound that's heard. Cutting, in this case, almost cleanly through this beam. Well, there are much more effective devices patented prior to 9/11, 2001, that use thermite in shaped cutter charges for the purposes of cutting through much thicker sections of steel, like we have in the World Trade Center buildings. Some of that steel is 3 and 4 inches thick, projecting molten iron in hundreds of milliseconds to cut through. So maybe that's the reason, or one of the reasons, they didn't want to use more commonly applied high energy explosives like C4 and RDX, because they don't have the capability to break through 4-inch thick slabs of steel as we have near the bottom of the Trade Center towers, all 3 of them. And they would also provide a much louder bang and a brighter flash, completely giving away the deceptive controlled demolition that we're looking at in the case of this building's destruction. So we also have a softer signature. In fact, there are devices, similar devices, whose casings themselves are made of consumable consolidated thermite. Nothing left behind but pools of molten iron, which we have plenty of evidence for, which we'll get to actually next week in this 3-part series. But what else was found in the meantime in the World Trade Center dust? 3-inch thick blanket of powder throughout World Trade Center. 8 samples, 7 altogether, were sent to this team. 4 of them were tested and put in through a rigorous analysis. The samples are red-gray chips they found in them. They're attracted by a magnet. They get real curious. Red on one side, gray on the other, dual layered, indicating they were applied by fluid, like a paint. They thought they were paint at first, but they're attracted to a magnet. So they zoom in or analyze the red layer very carefully. And what do they find? Again, iron, and aluminum, the key ingredients of thermite. But they get real curious now. Zoom in 50,000 times with a nuclear microscope and find what? Nano-sized particles, 1,000 times smaller than a diameter of the human hair, of the ingredients of thermite. Iron oxide crystals, aluminum platelets, set in an organic bed of oxygen, silica, and carbon. This organic material is what increases rapidly, making TNT capable of knocking things over. Expansion of those gases are very, very damaging. Well, interestingly enough, at 420 degrees Celsius, about 758 Fahrenheit, these samples ignite, producing an exothermic reaction, much more energy coming out of these. It's not paint, in other words. And when they do, they produce what? Molten iron microspheres with the same chemical signature as the molten iron microspheres produced and found in the World Trade Center dust. So you see, we know where these molten iron microspheres came from. They came from these chips. It's a self-corroborating, repeatable set of experimental data that can be used to prove exactly what brought down the World Trade Center and those responsible, because this is very sophisticated stuff. As if we didn't know where these spheres came from, they're found attached to partially ignited red-gray chips, as you see here and here. When you get materials down to this size at the nanoscale, the chemical reaction is virtually instantaneous. So they've engineered something that is an incendiary to become more explosive. Don't try this at home. It's made only in the most advanced defense contracting laboratories, not in a cave in Afghanistan. The 25-page peer-reviewed report concludes that this is active, unreacted thermitic material, a highly energetic pyrotechnic or explosive material. It remains unchallenged. I mean, people say, oh, that's paint, but they don't produce peer-reviewed papers dismissing the results of this work. That's how you challenge somebody's conspiracy theory. If it's peer-reviewed, you put forth a paper, and this has not been able to be accomplished. So what we're looking at is direct evidence of destruction with explosives. Fire doesn't create these features, any of them, let alone all of them. And fires, again, don't do that. Why? Well, let's look at some of the reasons. Steel conducts that heat away from the source. It's a conductor of heat. And so the steel beam never gets to that critical temperature, or rarely, 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, at which it can lose half of its strength and begin to sag. Especially when we fireproof it. It doesn't happen. We put 2-hour fire protection on the beams. That means the beam will last 2 hours before it sags, before it's compromised. 3 hours on the columns. And again, the fires can only last 20 or 30 minutes. So this is 4 to 6 times the protection that's needed. We also keep the contractors from building the buildings out of combustible materials, and we keep the tenants from bringing in huge fuel loads. So we don't have these kinds of problems. In addition to all of that, we put fire sprinklers in the buildings to put them out. In the case of Building 7, it said that the lower half of the building was, the fire sprinklers were compromised by the damaging of the water mains from the destruction of the towers when they went down earlier that day. So we look at the investigations into the building. 2002, we talked a little bit about the FEMA report. They had $600,000 worth of funding, which is almost nothing, especially compared to the investigation of Monica Lewinsky's dress. But even so, their efforts were hampered. They couldn't get access to the blueprints of the buildings. Their site access was described as a guided tour. They couldn't get out and look around. They couldn't appeal to the public for photographs and videos, as documented in the New York Times. So NIST takes over the investigation, throws out that metallurgical examination that we mentioned, came in with their own stated conclusion that fires caused the collapse. They're just going to put more money into that hypothesis, which we've already seen is completely unwarranted and fraudulent. Truthfully, they admit, we've had trouble getting a handle on Building 7 in 2006. This is after 4 years of overall investigation. And they throw out the FEMA Appendix C, which, by the way, the FEMA report said further investigation, research, and analysis are needed to resolve the issue of how Building 7 came down. For those hoping to resolve that issue, unfortunately, we have a huge problem and easily the largest and most perplexing structural failures in history. Up to 400 truckloads a day were removing the debris from the site, put onto barges, sent to China for recycling. This is the destruction of evidence in a crime scene. And with regard to Building 7, it started just 2 weeks after 9/11. Prompting Bill Manning, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, to cry out, crucial evidence that can answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately, but it didn't. And we have some experts who then comment on the destruction of this building, at least those experts without financial or political obligations that might sway their objective opinion in the matter, like Danny Jowenko. Let's listen to him.
Danny Jowenko is the expert on this in Europe. What did he say?
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten, zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Okay, and Hugo Bachmann, chair of the Department of Structural Dynamics, Earthquake Engineering. In my opinion, the building, World Trade Center 7, was with great probability professionally demolished. And one of 100 structural engineers signed on to the petition at AE 9/11 Truth, demanding a new investigation. Kamal Obeid from Berkeley says a localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does that sound like something fire can do? So we've hired the University of Alaska, one of the top forensic structural engineers in the country, Professor Leroy Hulsey, to perform the finite element analysis, computer modeling that NIST was tasked to do by Congress, but which we've seen failed miserably, producing fraudulent reports, as shown by this study here, because they used the same data. And they start out, no other tall steel frame building had ever failed due to fire. So we need to ensure that the public safety is met, and that the failure mechanism for this structure be understood. So first they examine the response to the fire loads. They rule out scenarios that would not cause the collapse, and then try to identify types and failures and locations that could have contributed to the observed collapse. Apples to apples, they used the same input data as NIST did, even though they found that much of it was fraudulent, as I pointed out earlier. They first simulate local structural response to fire loading for floors 13 and below, as NIST did. They examined the NIST collapse initiation hypothesis very carefully. And then they simulated numerous failure scenarios that could identify what would lead to the total collapse as observed on 9/11. So they start out putting this in AutoCAD, and they use Abacus software and SAP 2000, very sophisticated programs, modeling in parallel to see if they achieve the same results with different computing software, focusing on the same areas that NIST did with regard to their collapse theory that says that these beams here push this girder off of the seat on column 79. And through analysis after analysis, they find the fraud that we documented earlier, in addition to new frauds. And what did they find? NIST overestimated the exterior wall rigidity on the east. These exterior walls were actually flexible, so thermal movements were from the west to the east, not the east to the west. It's a completely different result. And that the movement at the seat was in the opposite direction, the girder seat to the column, on the column. They found that the shear connections on several beams were not broken, as NIST claimed. They found that the bolts fastening girder A2001 to its seat was not broken either. So they also found that 79, 80, and 81 columns did not fail. And if they could have failed, the building would have tipped over. So if NIST scenario were true, this is what you would have seen. And in fact, in their model, you began to see that, but they stopped it just 2 seconds into the overall collapse of the building. Or you would have seen their own model tip over, much unlike the video itself. So they conclude at the University of Alaska at Fairbanks, the collapse of World Trade Center 7 was a global failure, not a progressive collapse as claimed by NIST, which would have involved the sequential failure of columns. So the UAF study, the Halsey study here, finds that if indeed you take out all the columns in the building almost at once, the interior followed a second or so later by the exterior, you get the same results that you saw in the video. So fire did not cause the collapse of the WTC-7. Temperatures were not high enough to cause the weakening of the steel even. The thermal expansion did not result in a loss of support for the beams and girders, and the World Trade Center 7 did not experience a progressive collapse, but a global collapse caused by the near simultaneous failure of its columns, all of its columns. Comparing the video in the center, let's see, how do we get that video to go? There we go. To the computer models, University of Alaska on the left, NIST computer model on the right, what looks more reasonable? You can figure that one out. The foreknowledge is even more painful to watch. As in this case, we have an anonymous engineer predicting the collapse of this building because the chief asks him, well, how soon will it collapse? This is Chief Hayden. And this engineer says, well, in its current state, you have about 5 hours. Well, fire has never brought down a steel frame skyscraper before in history, ever. Not a fireproofed one. And this engineer, who they won't even give us the name of, if he exists at all, it says 5 hours. And sure enough, after witnesses hear those explosions we heard, the building comes down 5 hours later. The prediction could only have been made with foreknowledge. Even more interesting is these mysterious construction workers walking away from building 7, hearing an explosion, looking back over their shoulder to the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
You hear that?
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
Building is about to blow up. Moving back.
All right, guys.
We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
What? The building is about to blow up, flame and debris coming down? How do they know that the building is about to blow up? Were they working on that part of the building that was supposed to blow up? We'll look at some corroborating circumstantial evidence for that. But here's Kevin Mcpadden, former Air Force medic. We already heard his witnesses of explosions, but what did he hear before that on a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker?
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
What? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? What's going on here? What's going on here? Where the BBC announces the collapse of this building 20 minutes before it even happened.
Now, more on the latest building collapse in New York. You might have heard a few moments ago, I was talking about the Salomon Brothers building collapsing. And indeed it has. Apparently that's only a few hundred yards away from where the World Trade Center towers were. And it seems that this was not a result of a new attack. It was because the building had been weakened during this morning's attacks. We'll probably find out more now about that from our correspondent, Jane Stanley. Jane, what more can you tell us about the Salomon Brothers building and its collapse?
Well, only really what you already know. Details are very, very sketchy.
Sketchy indeed. What in the world is going on here? Did they have a script? Are they psychic? They apologize for this this error, citing the confusing events of the day. I don't think that would make them psychic. What about CNN? They do an even better job.
In New York, Alan Dobbs-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring.
50 stories went down? There's no other 50-story building that went down. There's no other building that was completely destroyed by the towers. He can only be referring, there were buildings that were partly damaged. He could only be referring to building 7 of the 47-story building. Had that building been destroyed at that time, we wouldn't have any videos of it because of the massive dust clouds obscuring it. We wouldn't even have the evidence of its free fall. So maybe it was supposed to go down at that time, and that story then would be consistent. Well, let's go to Larry Silverstein, the owner of the World Trade Center, which he acquired 6 weeks prior to 9/11. We'll get into that next week. But regarding Building 7, he has this to say a year later on PBS.
I remember getting a call from the fire department commander telling me that they were not sure they were going to be able to contain the fire. And I said, we've had such terrible loss of life. Maybe the smartest thing to do is pull it. And they made that decision to pull, and then we watched the building collapse.
He says, oh no, I didn't mean pull the building. I meant pull the firefighters out of the building. Well, pull it is used as a term in the controlled demolition industry to bring a building down. And firefighters don't make the decision to pull buildings. So this whole quote is a mess. But the firefighters weren't even in the building fighting the fire. They made the decision fairly early on not to attempt to fight the fire. due in part to the damage the World Trade Center 7 had from the collapsing towers. They were told not to fight the fire, so they weren't in there at all. So none of it makes sense in terms of what he's saying. No manual firefighting operations were taken. No firefighting in World Trade Center 7. They were told it had structural damage, that it was going to come down, or it could come down on its own. Even though the structural damage was not a factor in the building's collapse, according to NIST. So what have we found in our exploration today with regard to using this scientific method? Have we shown evidence that fire, or has NIST shown evidence that fire brought the building down? Or have we today shown evidence that controlled demolition brought the building down? This is for you to decide, and it's a weighty decision. We believe we've shown the key and characteristic and some very uncharacteristic features of controlled demolition, all of which being direct evidence of destruction with explosives, none of which is explainable by fire, and with additional circumstantial corroborative testimony. We believe we've shown today proof of controlled demolition. If you agree with us, then you have a problem, and you've got to sit on that problem squarely, as those of us at AE 9/11 Truth have done, so that you can take the most effective action that your conscience leads you to. So we'll answer your questions, though. We'll take a moment to do that. Andy, how do people ask the questions for those of you who are live watching with us?
Hi there. Okay, as I say every week, just submit your questions that you might have in the input form that we talked about earlier. That's at ae911truth.org. Just go to Continuing Education and select the live webinars. You'll see the box right there. In the meantime, we're going to tell you about some of the ways that you can get involved if now that you're informed you agree this evidence is quite compelling and warrants a new investigation.
Well, cool. And while you're there, subscribe to our email newsletter. We will send you the latest evidence that we're getting, the latest efforts we're making toward getting a real investigation. It takes like 2 minutes, maybe 1 minute, maybe even 30 seconds. You put your name and your email in there is all you do. And but get informed. Our website is full of information, and sign the petition while you're there. We have more than, hold on 1 second. We have more than 3,400 architects and engineers now, but 20,000 others supporting them. So everybody can sign the petition and support those architects. While you're there, also support us, because financially we are a nonprofit organization, and we don't get grants from the government or from corporations, right? This is all by donation that keeps us moving and educating the architects, engineers, the representatives from TV, newspaper, and also our elected representatives. We've got a lot of work that we're always doing. And so become a member, join the family of sustaining supporters. And you can, if you can't do any of that, from, as little as a cup of coffee a month, that cost, you can join us and march with us as we raise the truth about 9/11 throughout the general public, so we can demand a real investigation of Congress, putting more and more pressure on them. And volunteer if you can't. There's ways to do that, right, Andy?
Absolutely. The first choice is deciding to do it. And then you go to ae911truth.org, and there's a form you fill out. It's very quick, and we'll get you to work. But that's the most important thing, is just doing that work. And there's been so many accomplishments here over however long we've been in existence, like 2007 or 2008. I can never remember, but it's been a long time, and a lot of people have put in a lot of effort to get projects done and many campaigns, and has kept this issue alive so long. And We're going to keep it going until we have justice for all those people. So if you want to be part of something important, and if you're willing to do the work and donate that time, then please consider doing that and joining this team.
Definitely. And these slides are acting up. Anyway, encourage you also to work on your own. If you don't like volunteering with the organizations, at least send out our brochures, our information, the links to every architect and engineer you can find, elected representatives, television, radio, newspaper. Send them. Do you look? There's 3,400 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation. Hold on one second. I've got to fix this. We're going to, and I even rebooted today before I started. So I'm chagrined at this moment, but I'm going to do that again. Not reboot the computer, but the program itself. We'll start it from the current slide and see if it behaves better. There we go. Yeah, so share our brochures. You can get them, 100 of them for $10. Screen the DVDs. Tell everybody you know. Download the 134-page report. Print it. Take it to structural engineers in your local universities, civil engineering departments, structural engineering departments, physics, and watch the movie about Professor Halsey, made by director Dylan Avery, director of Loose Change, 9/11, and you can show this to others. You can get the DVD in our store now. And so I encourage you to order that and pass it around. And know that we've challenged NIST in many different ways. Here's one of them, our request for correction. Their key points of fraud have been called out. We're in an appeal process with them at this point and expecting imminent results. We will sue them if they do not answer adequately the tough questions that we have placed to them. And guess what? You can go to Congress and we're going to help you. Andy, how are we going to help them?
Absolutely. That's the way our government is designed and supposed to work. So let's pretend that is correct and try to reach out to these people and get these meetings and let them hear about this evidence that is so important. So the way that you do it and reach out to Congress is first find out who your congressman is. If you don't know already, you go to their website and you look up on their forums. You just submit a request for an interview, and you can contact us at congress@ae911truth.org and we'll give you some advice on how to reach out to them, even give you a letter if you need that. But basically, you make a request that you will talk to them about AE 9/11 Truth's evidence, World Trade Center 7, and of course this here, Bobby McIlvaine World Trade Center Investigation Act, and that's the path to justice for nearly 3,000 people who died that day. Bobby McIlvaine was entering the North Tower lobby on the morning of September 11th. He was killed by an explosion as he was doing so, and of course, by the nature of how he died, we have immediate questions that put the official story on notice as being incorrect. So basically, we named this bill after him, and it would set up a select committee. It can be passed in either house of Congress that would look into the evidence that Richard has been talking about all of these years. And it's written in such a way that they actually have to look into the specific evidence. They can't just glaze over it. But members of Congress don't react, and America doesn't work unless people get involved. So that's why you have to do that. And it's as simple as calling their office and telling them that they should support the Bobby McIlvaine Act. Because you do and a number of constituents do. You can also set up these meetings. We'll go on the phone with you and sit there and talk to your representative staffers about this evidence and follow up with them. You can write letters to them, and they are even doing telephone town halls now. So please get on there, even if they're talking about something else, even if they're talking about COVID or schools opening up or whatever, insert the World Trade Center evidence into the presentation. So those are just some of the ways that you can get involved, but the first one is to decide that you're going to act. So please do so.
Thank you, Andy. And what we acted, we submitted 60 exhibits to the U.S. Attorney in Manhattan. He wrote back saying he will comply. Now there's a different administration, and we're after them too. So we will not stop. We've sued the FBI. We're in a series of legal give and takes with with the U.S. attorney in this case. So we won't stop. They were required by Congress to give them all the evidence, including our evidence, which we gave them, which I presented to you today. And they did not, so we're suing them. We're inspired by 5 fire commissioners in a New York area, a fire commissioners group who voted unanimously for a new investigation, inspired by Chris Gioia, who says, you better believe that when the entire fire service of New York State is on board, we'll be an unstoppable force. And so they work hard also. And they were inspired by the landmark documentary that we made, 9/11 Explosive Evidence, Experts Speak Out. I'm going to show you how you can watch this for free, but take a look, a couple of minutes here. We have 40 high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out this evidence.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. There are lots of them. They can go on. We could speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to the descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved.
In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red grade crystals are very high temperature incendiaries.
We have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
And yes, you can watch it free on YouTube. Just search 9/11 explosive evidence. And that's the 1-hour version. You can also see the 90-minute version by getting it on our the DVD at our store at 911truth.org. And that has the extended version also, which is a double DVD, a bonus DVD, which with the additional interview material from all these 40 experts. So encourage you to go that route and go to beyondmisinformation.org and look at the very professional 50-page booklet assembled by Ted Walter and on our team. And you can also download it for free, the PDF. So I encourage you to do that there. And look at our classic lecture on this series, 9/11 Blueprint for Truth, free on YouTube, as is the 15-minute documentary narrated by actor Ed Asner, free on YouTube, all about Building 7. And so, hey, let's get to those questions, Andy. I think we have some, right?
Yes, we do. The first one asks, is it a contradiction to tell us that a global collapse will result if you eliminated just one particular column in Building 7, and at the same time say for the public safety we must deny our computer model data inputs for peer review? After all, NIST computer model data would only tell us how they arrived at column 79's failure. Plus, they say failure under any circumstance of column 79 would give us the same results.
Interesting question. It's certainly a contradiction to claim that a global collapse would result if you eliminate one particular column in the building. That was proven by the Halsey study and your own intuition. These buildings are very redundantly designed. But at the same time, deny the computer input data. Yeah, it's like they want it both ways. Trust us is what they're saying. Take out one column, this building comes down. After all, we have a computer model. We won't let anybody look at the insides of how that computer model works, but you can trust us. No, we've shown so many reasons today, at least 36 reasons not to trust NIST. And we're going to show another 36 or so next week and the week after. Andy?
Okay, our next question asks, there are many buildings brought down on purpose by controlled demolition. Do we know how often the steel from those buildings gets sent to China?
No, I don't know of any steel frame building that has collapsed due to fire. First of all, so I doubt that steel has been sent to China. There have been some collapses of concrete buildings by earthquakes, which we showed. So no, I don't think it's a regular. I mean, scrap steel does go to China. They're the largest procurers of it, but.
Right, they're asking specifically about controlled demolitions, when it's an acknowledged controlled demolition.
Right. I don't know what happens to that steel. I haven't followed up on that. Most of those, well, yeah, there are steel frame. That's a good question. Do you have any answers, Andy?
I actually don't have any insights on that in terms of, of how often it gets sent specifically to China. I know there has to be some kind of place that the steel goes to, and it could vary from place to place, especially if there's other contractors or businesses that may want access to that steel. You can make more money possibly selling it, but I don't know. We'll have to look into that, and if anyone out there has a good answer, then we'd be happy to get it.
Yeah, well, certainly if it was a structural collapse, not on purpose in a controlled demolition, but say any kind of an accidental collapse, the steel certainly would have been studied thoroughly before ever being sent to China like it was in this case.
Okay, our next question says, NIST claimed that the water supply was cut off by the collapse of the Twin Towers, but my understanding is that the water supply came from the north of Building 7, not from the south where the Twin Towers stood. Any comments?
I don't know where the water supply came from. I'd like to have your evidence from the questioner as to the location of the water supply for the fire sprinkler mains in particular in Building 7. If they came from a different direction than the Twin Towers, then that would expose yet another lie from NIST.
Absolutely. Anytime you have information, send it in. Send us a brief description, as much as you need to tell us what the situation is or what you're specifically having us look at, and we can take a look at it. Next question says, well, this was from YouTube, and this was sort of a comment / question in a conversation between two people, but it said, maybe the fires ignited the carefully placed demolition explosives. So does the fires provide ignition for the explosives?
Right.
Or could they just go off by themselves? I personally, if I was setting up something like this, which I would never do, but I would not want to rely on random office fires, because that's exactly what they are, random. So if I'm relying on that as my trigger for setting off the explosives, that's not a very good plan when you're pulling off a huge deception. So I would imagine that it wasn't the fires had any relation to the explosives.
Right. I'm guessing that the questioner is actually asking, what if they were meant to set off intentionally, but they were set off accidentally by the fires? I don't even know what to say about that either. It's certainly possible that some of the explosives got damaged by the fires, but the rest of them, they're probably wired independently so that some damage didn't to one subcomponent of the overall system of explosives wouldn't set the whole thing off inadvertently or damage it so it couldn't be set off.
Okay, our last question is also a YouTube comment. It's a very general question, but it's a good one to revisit every once in a while. It says, why haven't the government agencies looked into this?
Well, they have hand-picked agencies, the FEMA and NIST in this case, who were tasked with dealing with this. And the NIST in particular is under the Department of Commerce. It's under which leadership was replaced by the Bush administration when they came to power, NIST and Department of Commerce. So presumably that gave the administration a lot more power in having this investigation go the way they wanted it to. Other government agencies were told to back off, presumably, that these particular agencies had the jurisdiction. In fact, Congress gave NIST the jurisdiction in the Act, the NC Star Act. So, you have any thoughts on that one, Andy?
I just think that governments, any kind of government, are notoriously proponents of not wanting things shaking up too much through anybody's term as president or prime minister or whatever. So the people who head up agencies typically are the type of people that aren't going to shake things up too much for their leader. And they get there by not looking into things that they're told not to look into. That's my experience by dealing with people who are at the top of many institutions. They're there because they're looking out for the interests of the institution more so than, I believe, this is my opinion, the public good. So that's how this kind of complacency gets set in. And a lot of that young optimism and that idea that I'm going to go out and tackle the world and I'm going to chase every injustice that comes my way, that kind of gets worn out of you as you rise up agencies into your 40s and stuff and start thinking about retirement. So that's just my own psychological analysis. I'm not a psychiatrist by any stretch of the imagination, but I believe that that's what plays into it on a personal level. Plus, you have all the cognitive dissonance stuff that's been going over ad nauseum on the internet, where people just can't believe that this would happen, so they refuse to look into it. So that's my general explanation.
Yeah, right on. Well, thank you. We have looked at the third tower that came down on 9/11 today. That is World Trade Center Building 7. And I encourage you to follow up, learn more, and act. Again, support us as part of your action. We need that support so we can get this information to everybody. Next week, we come back at 1 o'clock on Thursday with part 2 of 9/11 An Architect's Guide, the Twin Towers' explosive destruction. We'll be diving into the sudden near freefall collapse of these towers, the high velocity lateral ejections, the shattering of the steel frame, the midair pulverization of concrete, and a whole lot more. And then the week after that, third Thursday in April, we'll be looking at part 3, the Twin Towers in Extreme Heat, in which we examine the what we only touched on this week in terms of these incendiaries, which were engineered to become explosive, and the extreme temperatures that can't possibly be accounted in the official story. So join us, and thanks again for joining us today. Thanks, Andy, for your help. Thanks, everybody. We'll see you again next week. Bye for now.